Welcome to the Be Engaged podcast, the show where we go beyond the headlines and into the real conversations shaping our industries, institutions, and collective future. I'm your host, Michelle Harper. For those that are new to the podcast, I bring 25 years of experience in the space sector, spanning from national security missions, U.S. Space Force, technology development, launch assurance, and now helping bridge the next chapter to the commercial space economy. So this podcast is part of my broader mission to promote unity. So today's episode, I care deeply about space policy and global cooperation. We're at a pivotal moment in the human space activity where 1960-era treaties are being tested in the 21st century realities. So it's increasing our commercial access, global competition, and emerging technologies like AI, huge, and autonomy. And that's exactly why I want to bring in today's guest to you. So joining me is Thomas Zimmerman, an independent policy advisor whose career spans NASA, where he served as the senior policy advisor to the administration, focused on space diplomacy and sustainability. Thomas also worked at the White House, National Security Council, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So his years in government, civil service at the intersection of global affairs and innovation is quite the podcast episode. So I'm excited to share it. So together, we explore some critical themes in today's conversation. So we explored the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. That's a good one. I mean, do you remember that one? That's a good one. We also talk about what the Artemis Accords represent in today's fragmented geopolitical environment. I think that's safe and fair to say. We also talk about why global cooperation in space is hard and why it matters more than ever today. So the rise of independent consultants in space and policy workforce is happening now. And so we're going to be touching on that as well. We want to understand where's that industry headed. And yes, we get into the deeply serious topic of Star Trek, Star Wars references in meetings, because in this industry, you have to know pretty much both of those. So this is a conversation for everyone serious about future of space, not just the technology that gets us there, but the governance and global relationships that will shape what we do when we arrive. So whether you're a national security, commercial innovation, policy, or just, a space advocate, curious listener, get ready. Let's get into it. Hello, this is the Be Engaged podcast, where we bring together brilliant minds, elevate discussions across many industries to promote unity. I'm your host, Michelle Harper. So today, our guest is Thomas Zimmerman. Thomas is an independent advisor focused on international policy. So Thomas has 15 years experience across government, civil, and political campaigns. Most recently, he served on the senior policy advisor to the NASA administration, focusing on space diplomacy, emerging technologies, and space sustainability. Welcome to the podcast, Thomas. Welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
So the format here is fun facts. I think I'm gonna go over 5. There's 5
Okay.
top. There's like 17 that I came up with. But
There's
fun
so many fun
facts.
facts in the world.
Yes. Okay. Space policy fun facts. The Outer Space Treaty, which was 1967, actually. The weapon ban in space. We can talk about that. Weapon ban. There's details there. No one owns the moon policy, which again, you can land on the moon. No one can own the land on the moon. Well, we'll see. And then flags in space doesn't necessarily mean ownership. And the last one is the Artemis Accords 2020. So that's the modern day update to the space governance. The Accords is like a peaceful exploration signed by 35 countries, however, not Russia and China. So of those policies, am I missing any? Are those the top?
I mean, I think Outer Space Treaty is a fascinating one, and in part because it was, signed in 1967, and it says a lot that there hasn't been any multilateral agreement since then. Well, that's not entirely true. We had the rescue agreement, and there's been a few others that sort of added on to and modified the Outer Space Treaty. But the reality is, space and the way that we engage with it is very different than it was in 1967. And so I think the fact that we haven't really reached a consensus since then, despite multiple attempts, really says something about how much need there is for it, right? We're entering into a moment where the number of countries in space is growing dramatically. And yet the framework we use to determine how we approach that is in a pre-Apollo era or pre-moon landing era, right? And so it's a
Yeah.
very different space.
So why has the policy side of it, governance side of it, lagged?
I think, I mean, the not compelling but true answer is because it's hard, right? There was a period of time in which the number of countries that were involved was basically two. It was us and the Soviets, and so there was an impetus for us to try to delineate, what we would and would not do and where the rules of the road were. And then for a long stretch of time after the Apollo era, the US was really the only player in town. Obviously, the Russians would strongly disagree with that, but we were working together. We did Mir, we worked together on ISS. So there felt like there was less of an imperative to update it. And what was interesting was there was actually been a few attempts, right? You had the Moon Treaty that the United States did not sign on to. And that was in part an effort by a bunch of these smaller states that were looking forward to the day in which they hoped to be players in all this, but weren't yet. And it's very hard to reach international agreements when one party, for lack of a better term, kind of holds all the cards. But that's changing, right? And so whether this creates an opportunity for some sort of updated agreement or new agreements remains to be seen. But I think, the Artemis Accords is a part of attempting to address that. But it's hard to imagine in the near term the US, the Chinese, and the Russians all getting in a room and agreeing on like real substantive multilateral space policy.
Yes, in 2025, which is what we're in,
Yeah, yeah.
I am not sure we're going to come to the table and talk about space and peace in space. I wish we were, but not sure that's on the docket right now.
I agree with that to a degree, but I think, the Artemis Accords are an interesting animal, right? They were sort of an effort made during the first Trump administration to establish some basic principles that we would all agree to. And the messaging, at least for the last 4 years, has been very clear that it is open to the Chinese and the Russians to sign. If the Chinese and the Russians wanted to participate, they're more than welcome to participate. They obviously see it as a US-led process, so I understand, why that's difficult. But what I think is meaningful about it is, aside from the principles, is it's created a forum, right? There are actual gatherings where all of I want to say now 55. I should know that my friends back at NASA are going to be disappointed in me. I think it's 50, 54, 55 signatories um, all get in a room and actually try to talk through some of these like difficult principled issues under the idea that, while Columbia is not going to be a major space power, in the next 10 years, in 30 years it could be, right? And so it's important to have them at the table and have them be a part of those conversations. And the fact that there's actually a space for that to happen, in addition to you and Copious, which is a slightly different beast, I think is a significant thing, even if it doesn't involve, the other largest player in this whole thing.
I like the fact that NASA is in the forefront of the negotiations. I don't think when you talk about organizations like the Department of Defense or like the White House, it feels like NASA is the right organization that's really there for peace, mankind, exploration, research. That seems like the right feel when you're talking about space and negotiating.
Yeah, and I think part of it is NASA has an incredibly strong brand, right? And the reason why a lot of the countries that have signed on to the Artemis Accords um, do so is because of the desire to be associated with NASA and what NASA stands for. And I think one of the things that was great about being at the agency is in a moment where so much has been politicized, right? It is this sort of unique thing that people have been drawn to and can get excited about and can get invested in across party lines. And you saw that with the many different people in Congress who came from very different political perspectives, who, when it came to civil space issues, would work together. And I think that is a unique and important thing.
Well, great. I love that fun fact. I like all the policies, and that's what the focus of today is going to be about. Okay, so let's go to the main discussion. So you and I, so we were connected through a mutual friend here in town, Tom. So it sounds like you guys go back pretty far. How did this all come about?
Tom and I go back a ways. We worked at the Center on International Cooperation together back in the day on Afghanistan issues. I had early in my career worked in Afghanistan, was my sort of first job out of college, was driving a Toyota Corolla around Afghanistan, interviewing students for State Department funded exchange programs and managing libraries and whatnot. And Tom has been doing incredibly important work on Afghanistan and vaccination and things like that for a long time.
Huh?
And so we ended up on the same team together. And I mean, he's just one of the most dynamic people I've ever met.
Yes. Yes.
And so I'm grateful that while we've swapped coasts, he's now out on the West Coast, and I've moved back from LA to DC. We've stayed in touch, but yeah, when he reached out, it's like anybody who Tom vouches for is good enough for me. So it's
Oh,
great to be
good.
here.
Well, our kids are in the same schools, and his wife and I have known each other for a really long time, and great family. Just a fantastic
They're
family. So
wonderful.
great.
I also like he has this whole he has it figured out. He has this beautiful place just up the hill from the beach. And my husband went and stayed with him once, and he, has this routine where he can just grab his surfboard and walk down to the water and do morning surfing and then walk back up the hill again. And, the Potomac doesn't really offer those sorts of things. So I just,
Maybe not.
I was like, why did we make different life choices and why did I make the wrong ones? It's great.
Well, the Potomac has its own values. Hey, a lot of boating.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, I love living in DC. DC is a great town, and I'd lived here before. But the months of like July and August, I really do question why I opted to leave Southern California. So we're entering
Yeah.
that moment. But the rest of the year, the fall and spring are just magical times here. Sometimes I
Summer is a
regret
little hot. It's a
it's a
little
little
muggy.
hot. Yes.
Okay, so walk us through how did you get here? So from college, were you like, you know what, this is what I want to do with my life? Is this part of the plan? Or walk us through your background.
It's been kind of roundabout. So I, in college, was trying to decide between political science, film, and astronomy at that point. And so this is senior in high school, came in, took all three. Turns out I'm terrible at math, very, very bad at math. And so in my mind, it was like you're either a scientist or an engineer or an astronaut. And those are the three ways to get involved in space policy in NASA. And so I just assumed that that was off the table. But as a proud space camp kid, and to my knowledge, the only person I've met at least who died in a space camp simulation, which is a weird.
Wait, real for real, or is that just a
No, I was in a we were doing a simulation on the ISS, and I was in the airlock, and someone opened the airlock while I was in it, and the counselors told me that I had to sit out on the side for the remainder of the simulation because I would not have made it through that experience. And I remember just being very, like, less so the fact that I couldn't participate in the simulation and more the fact that they announced that, I had not made it and just moved on. And I was like, there's
my
not
gosh.
recognition of this. Like, I don't,
Yeah,
come on. But yeah, so I did space camp and loved that. And that was, it's like I think a lot of kids, NASA was a part of my childhood, right? It's like this aspirational thing. But when I came to terms with the fact that that was probably not my future, I went into international policy and through a series of events ended up in Afghanistan right out of college. And from there, uh, got very invested in Barack Obama's candidacy while I was in Afghanistan still, and moved out to Iowa, basically. I flew straight from Kabul to Des Moines and
it's a
walked into the
change. That's
office.
a bit of a culture shift, I would imagine.
I mean, I still think Des Moines is one of the best cities on earth, but I just remember like walking in and like the shower had unlimited hot water, and I went and there was like a pasta restaurant where they just had like, large glasses of beer and large things of pasta, and it just felt so novel and exciting after having been in Kabul for a year. That in my mind, like Des Moines still has this like mystique to it.
It's beautiful. I'm
Where,
from the Midwest, so I love Des Moines. Yeah.
really? Where,
Yeah.
where in the
I'm from
Midwest?
Kansas originally, the Wichita area. So
I,
they're
you know
my
what?
people.
It is funny. I'm surrounded by Kansas people out here. I
Yeah.
live. It's like everywhere I look, there's like half of the state has moved to the District of Columbia. So you're
You
good,
know,
good people. The thing is, it's the people who move here from Kansas. It's like there's so much state pride, and there's so much pride
uh-huh.
in being from Kansas in a way. And I say that as a Texan, we are like sometimes overboard with our state pride, and I am a guilty party in that. But I feel like people from Kansas, the reason why I know I have so many Kansas people in my life is because they talk about Kansas all the time with this sort of like
Yeah.
loving
It's a great
reminiscence.
upbringing. It's
Yeah.
stable. It's everybody's really nice. It's a fantastic upbringing.
But yeah, so I did campaign work and then moved from there to the Department of Defense and then where I was working on Pakistan policy and then from there to the White House where I worked at the National Security Council. And then kind of bopped around between government and political campaigns and think tank world, but all broadly in the security space, global affairs, security, negotiation space. And when I came back into the administration this time around, I came back to the White House and I was heading up the personnel team for national security, foreign policy, state, DoD, all that. There was an opportunity to go work at NASA. And the role was sort of described as being a, um, international policy advisor in part because NASA, so much of what it does now is with partners. Everything it does is international. It has like 700 international agreements with, almost 150 some odd countries. I, of course, got there to discover that there's like a mini State Department within NASA that are doing incredible work on this stuff. But, I think the thing that really made it exciting for me on top of the fact that I'd finally get to fulfill those space camp dreams was the fact that, when I was at NSC and DoD, incredible teams, incredible work. But so much of the work was focused on how do we prevent bad things from happening, or how do we take this bad thing that is happening and make it not as bad, right? Lessen the negative impacts. And that's vital, right? You don't understand all of the terrible things that have been averted and the catastrophes that we have not had to face because people got on the phone and talked through it. Um, but the thing about NASA is you're building something. It's like every day you're working towards this positive vision of what could be and what our international partnerships should look like. And that was an incredibly refreshing thing that I
It
feel very
is.
lucky to have done.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's the more positive aspect of how can we use space for good and not consistently focus on how do we protect each other and defend against each other. It's more of the research, it's more of the exploration, it's more of the child inside of you of where can we go? What can we reach? Where's the end of this? Which is, to be determined. So you get your dream job. You get NASA's, your dream job. What did that feel like?
It was incredible. It is one of the most earnest places I have ever worked in my life. I had to learn to speak engineer very quickly, despite the fact that that was clearly not my strong suit. Also, as an aside, I think it will probably be the only place I will work where there's a baseline Star Trek knowledge expectation in every meeting. I remember
Yes, there
going
is,
in.
or Star Wars, and there's a
Oh,
lot of like Star Trek, Star Wars issues. I'm like, wow, this is serious.
does that happen in like, do you see that as much in the commercial sector? Is that like a ubiquitous thing?
Absolutely. Everybody has a Star Wars, Star Trek background. I mean, I've definitely watched the movies, but I'm not saying that I've done a whole lot of research and in-depth analysis of it. But everybody else has things. There's conference rooms that are named based on Star Wars, Star Trek. There's program names based on that. It's very interesting. It's really funny.
Well, and it's like an expected base knowledge. Like people will make Star Trek references in like presentations where understanding what they are referencing is essential to understanding the point of their presentation,
Yeah, it's the whole foundation, and you got nodding heads, and you're like, wait, what? What
Yeah.
exactly are they talking about here?
And I was a Star Trek kid. I went to conventions. I had like the Captain Picard cutout in my bedroom, and there would be references that I had no idea what they were talking about, right?
You got through the first whatever hurdle if you went to those conventions. I did not. I did not grow up going to Star Trek conventions. And so it's you got to brush up on your material.
You feel like you've gone through cram school, like you kind of take notes and then go back and like now I'm going to start watching, Voyager to make sure that I understand
Well,
what.
I picked it
Yeah.
up over time, and there's some real deep people that I'm like, let's have a discussion about this, and they will talk about it for quite some time. So just talk to them about it. You don't even need cliff notes. You've got the real people that know all the details anyway.
Well, and sometimes you'll have people who decide to like make references to more obscure shows. There'll be like a Babylon 5 reference thrown in, and that's just like too deep a cut. I'm like, you're
Yeah,
just showing off now.
yeah,
This is an unnecessary flex in this context. You're already a genius.
exactly,
We don't
exactly.
need to do that.
Oh, how funny. So you also did something with the Pacific Council in international policy in Los Angeles. Is that what that was amplifying West Coast voices in global affairs? There's a lot going on in LA today in June of
Yeah.
2025, for folks in the future. Tell us more about that.
I want to know from the folks in the future how this all plays out. So that was a fascinating job. So I actually moved out to Los Angeles for my husband's grad program. And when we were moving out there, my initial assumption was that I would need to find work that was not global policy focused, that I would need to kind of pivot off of that. Which, when you step back, is kind of absurd, right? Because California is the world's fourth or fifth largest economy. Los Angeles is one of the largest population and economic hubs in the country. And yet there's an assumption that all global policy discussions either happen in DC or New York, right? It's all sort of East Coast focused. And so what was fun about the Pacific Council is it's basically an organization whose premise is that there should be more West Coast voices in global policy discussions, right? We need to make sure that the perspectives of California are reflected in discussions that will impact California sometimes disproportionately. But the other thing that was fascinating about it is that California's a state is a wildly diverse state, and Los Angeles in particular, in terms of the background of the various immigrant populations that make up the fabric of the city. And so you'd have these conversations, and there would be people who had very direct firsthand experience with a lot of these topics. Like I remember once we were trying to have a North Korea conversation, and one of my colleagues said, well, there's a North Korean diaspora community in Los Angeles. Like, have we thought about
Wow.
reaching out to them? And they have these,
Yeah.
there's a community gathering space. It used to have like a North Korean restaurant that I don't think is open anymore. And that is something that you just don't get in many places, right? In DC, where obviously we have a ton of North Korean focused conversations, there's not like a large North Korean community that I can tap
Just
into.
hanging.
Of course, now
No,
that I say that, somebody's going to pipe in with the fact that there's in fact a large North Korean restaurant that I don't know about.
you're like,
But
okay, yeah.
Um, but it makes LA a pretty unique space. And so I think I really enjoyed the opportunity to look at a lot of these same policy issues from a state and local perspective, right? These things that we sort of talk about in an abstract way, whether it be international development, whether it be, you know, trade negotiations, whether it's, armed conflict, right? What does that mean to individuals who like live outside of DC? What does it mean to the daily lives of people who live in Los Angeles, but also places like Kansas, right? Why should they care about international development, and how does that enrich their lives in any important way? I think there's actually something great about having a lot of those policy conversations removed from the sort of hubbub of the district. I mean, the conversations that people are having here are, obviously important in their own right, but you need to have those different perspectives because it makes the policy better and it enriches those conversations.
In general, diversity in thought and just diversity in backgrounds can make a better product. Actually, there's a lot of research involved in that. That it's been proven time and time again. Those diverse thoughts, the diverse backgrounds, the diverse people coming together to create a product, create a policy, create something, it's stronger, it's better, and it lasts longer.
I think you see that everywhere. I mean, we saw that at NASA, right? You
Mhm.
know, whenever you have people in a room who come from different backgrounds and think about things in different ways, inevitably come up with solutions and answers to questions that I would never be able to generate because that is not my background, right? You know, it's like that's just not the perspective that I came into the room with, and so it allows you to really make sure that you are looking at questions from all the angles. And I mean, my goodness, like in global policy, the idea that having diverse perspectives when the whole ball game is trying to understand the perspectives of other parties who are coming from entirely different contexts than you. I mean, it couldn't be more important.
I would agree with that. Okay, so now you're kind of out of your day job of the government, the civil, and you're into independent consulting. How is it going? What have you learned? What is this experience like in independent consulting?
It's interesting. I mean, I took a nice long break, did some hiking in Nepal and Bhutan, just like got out of DC
Oh,
for a bit, which
yeah.
was do recommend drinking tea staring at mountains, 10 out of 10. But you know, it's this is the first time that I've sort of worked without a team, and so that has been an adjustment. I think I have been so lucky to work with so many incredible people that sort of adapting to this space where it's you know it's you and then whoever it is you're working with on a particular project, right? You don't sort of have like a consistency there. But the flip side of that is that it allows you to like really dip your toe into a whole host of new issues and new work cultures. And you know, I do think that much like the diversity conversation we were having before, it really does help you think about how you approach your workflow when you get to see how other people do it, right? Getting to work with other organizations shows you new ways of approaching challenges that you would never have encountered when you're just sort of in your own space. It's kind of like, you know, in the same way I joke that I've been as fortunate to work with some terrible bosses as good bosses. I will not name those. But you learn from places where you see
Mhm.
management gone awry and
Yeah.
where it's working. And so
And you're
um,
like, hey, I'm not going to be that type of a manager. I'm
yeah,
not going to treat people that way. And
what
then the good managers, you're like, okay, yeah, you're learning no matter what. Each experience is learning. And so the more experiences you have in life, it just makes a more well-rounded situation. And now your big experience is being an independent consultant. And I think a lot of folks are doing that right now. There's been a big shift in the civilian and the government workforce. And so we're going to be seeing a lot more folks like you going into independent consulting with massive amount of background, massive amount of experience and just expertise like crazy. And I feel like our workforce is changing into independent consulting gig work, if you will, working with many clients, maybe not being on salary on, the books of one company or one organization, but helping multiple. I'm interested to see, 5 years from now, how that shapes things and plays out.
I think there's a few things driving that. It's particularly the case in DC that you have a lot of incredibly talented individuals with a huge background of knowledge and experience who are suddenly out of jobs, right? You know, everyone's seeing the news and is seeing that the workforce has been thinned tremendously and those people are now out on the market. And I think the flip side of that is that you have a bunch of companies and organizations that are kind of waiting to see how things settle out before they make hiring decisions, right? Like obviously I talk with a lot of space companies at the moment, and with the space budget that's been rolled out, there's real questions as to whether certain sectors will or will not exist in a year's time. And so there's, I think, a real interest in trying to find individuals who they can kind of go to on a project by project basis until a lot of that settles out. And at the same time, you have a lot of people who have left being in government for a long time, and there's actually something kind of nice and unique about being able to control the structure of your day and
Yes.
control
The
the kinds
freedom.
of projects you take on and which ones you don't. And, you know, to the earlier point, which teams you want to work with and which ones you don't want to work with. And so,
It's like capitalism for the workforce. It's like, hey,
yes,
this is
yes.
who I really want to work with, and this is the interesting stuff. The folks and the content that's not interesting are not going to get those gig consulting people working for them, or they're not going to get the best of the best. And so ultimately it's like, what's the value of that? If that's not working, then that automatically kind of plays itself out.
It will be interesting to see how companies adapt to that, right? Because I think of so many, the gig economy doesn't work for a lot of people. It is structurally doesn't work. But also, I think often companies, because they have people on a contract by contract basis, sometimes don't feel like they need to think of the contract workers or consultants they bring in as long-term relationships, right? But I think in part because there are so many people who are currently floating around, and also you have all of these different companies that are sort of approaching these short-term employment models, there's more competition. And so how do companies adapt to actually looking at themselves as being entities that need to be able to attract top talent for these shorter term windows? And I don't know how that plays out, but it'll be interesting.
Yeah, we are living in the middle of history. It feels that way. I'm very well aware we're living in the middle of history. Part of the podcast is I want to document it. I want to document what we're doing, what we're talking about, because I feel like for a fair amount of time going forward, there's going to be a lot of talk and books and research done on this particular time in our world.
How has doing this podcast shaped how you think about that? Like, do you feel like having these conversations has made you have realizations about the moment we're in?
Yes. So I think the number one, the connections that I've made, this is all about unity. Started this last August. So it was a little bit before the new administration had come into effect. I have a foundation, I have a phenomenal amount of personal networks, social personal networks. I wanted to elevate that and let folks like yourself assume we're in the same kind of generation and that normally would not be on social media, that normally are not on podcasts, and say, hey, we're shaping this world, and I think you have to be in social media and kind of be out there to shape the younger generation on this is how we work, this is how we talk, this is what we're thinking right now. I think as if we're educating folks, the connections being made has been absolutely phenomenal. The gig economy that has come at us. I've learned quite a bit about AI. I have an AI background, a technology background. And so in each different industry that I talk to, I usually talk a little bit about AI. How do you think AI is either going to disrupt or manifest your industry?
I mean, I think that the space industry is uniquely well suited for AI, right? And part of it is because it has been baked into the DNA of the work entities like NASA have been doing for decades. It was actually interesting when I was at NASA, there was an executive order that I'm sure you're well familiar with that came out about the implementation of AI in government. And one of my roles was working with our career AI experts to help shepherd the implementation of that within the agency. And the thing that I found fascinating about it was there were real pockets of pushback, right? There was real resistance to the idea that AI, as it has been spoken about in the news, has anything to do with the work that they're doing, or that it was going to be anything but a risk or a detriment or replacement to the talents at NASA. And what we had to have conversations with folks about was, this is something NASA's been doing for a long time. When you're communicating with new horizons way out past Pluto, right? When we're working with future scenarios in which there are humans on the surface of Mars and there's a multi-minute time delay. Machine learning is essential to a lot of the work that we do, and it's been a part of the work that we've been doing for a long time. And so I think it's helping people connect the advancements and innovation that have already happened in the space sector to this new conversation that we're having about AI with the emergence of all these large language models and whatnot. So I do think that because it is sort of a part of the character of it, and just because of the scales on which the space industry has to operate, I do think while there's been a little bit of concern, people will see the ways in which this will enable us to do things that we just couldn't have imagined before. And that's really exciting. It's like you think about the ways in which we're taking this immense amount of data that's coming in from James Webb and hopefully Nancy Grace Roman at some point in the future if things don't go haywire there with the budget. But it's a tremendous amount of data, and having the ability to really process that and pull out discoveries that would have never been possible if we'd actually had somebody manually happy to go through these things, I think is going to enable us to make discoveries that would have just been completely unimaginable a decade ago. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And it all happened at the right time. So we didn't have that data because I mean, it goes back to computers and internet. And when they invented the internet, and then that created all this data, and then, oh, AI comes in to process and assess and learn about the data. It's a perfect situation, and it's all been building on itself for some time. So it's pretty impressive.
I'm curious, you mentioned a moment ago about how, you feel it's important to be involved in social media and to be a part of this broader global conversation that's happening. And I do feel like I struggle sometimes with the fact that I know I need to be engaged and I need to be involved and paying attention and contributing because that is the venue in which so much of the global conversation happens right now. And I mean, it gives me incredible insights, right? Like follow people who are giving on the ground reporting in Mogadishu in a
Huh?
way that would have been impossible in like the early 2000s. But at the same time, it's exhausting, right? It is such a
Yes, it's
venue
never
for
ending.
conflict. And how do you navigate that? How do you sort of balance those two things?
Yeah, I completely agree with your assessment that it's important to be in the social discussion. And again, it's really for our younger generation. I'm a parent, and so they need to have the example of what is really going on. And we're not trying to be exaggerating or, this is as authentic as I am. This is who I am. And so the more that we can get out there to train and educate the next generation is critical. Now, is it overwhelming? Yes. There's some really smart engineers that have generated and created social media algorithms and content to make it addictive. And so it's real. Your brain is addicted. I didn't give my oldest a phone until 13, and I try to be very, very aware of how long they're on, especially YouTube and the shorts and the short time span. It's just been engineered to be addictive. And I know that my brain gets addicted to it. And I think we're right in the middle. Some folks are like, I'm absolutely off of it. Well, then you're going to miss that global conversation. I'm 100% on it. Well, you're missing the actual social interaction of real people on a day-to-day basis. So how are we going to get that balance back? Also, the administration really leaned into social media. That was one of the things I was like, wow, I better figure this out as a technologist. If you can become president by really harnessing the power of social media, probably a good idea to figure out what's going on here. So that combined with the media, combined with get attention, it's a capitalist component. The more attention that they can get with an addictive or brain addiction type approach for the shorts and just how it's been generated, that's all because of money. That's for capitalists and for power. A lot of it's for power and influence. So, my approach is I definitely take 10 p.m. My phone goes off, everything goes off. I don't look at anything after 10 p.m. I don't look at anything before 7 a.m. because I got to take it down. That's foundationally number one. And then during the day, I do monitor my own online usage as well as my kids' online usage. And then the content that I'm bringing in, is it negative? Does it make me feel bad? Is it educational? Yes, education might make you feel bad, but you need to be educated. Or is it positive? Does it lift me up? And is it something that I can communicate with the greater friends face to face in the real world? So I'm very much trying to figure it out. And I don't know even this podcast, I'm trying to figure out, I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing. It seems to be working and it seems to be successful based on the metrics that I track. So again, this current situation that we're in the world, we're figuring out a lot at the same time. We're in the middle of major shifts in 4, 5, 6 areas. The entire federal government is shifting in 4, 5, 6 areas. And so this is going to be the discussion for many years to come on these particular years and these moments for sure.
Well, I think just having that awareness is really important. I mean, that's something that I wish I had your restraint and staying off the phone after 10 p.m.
Yeah.
That is a life lesson
Well,
I
I'm
will
also
take away from this
exhausted. I've got 3
conversation.
kids. I have a full-time job. I'm pretty exhausted. That's part of it too.
Yeah, but it is. I think the fact that you're actually bringing some methodology to it, and at least it forces you to be conscious about how you approach these things and when you use things and when you don't. And I think that's a harder thing to do than I think many people give it credit for.
Yeah.
So something I need to work on.
Well, thank you, Thomas, for being on the podcast. This was so much fun.
It was great meeting you. And when you see Tom, tell him I say hello. I need
I
to get more.
definitely will. Okay. So quote of the podcast. What do you think if you think back about some of the things we talked about, what's the quote of the podcast for you?
Quote of the podcast. Well, I will say I did not expect an extended Star Trek convention divergence,
Yeah.
but it was delightful. It was nice to revisit that time.
It's very interesting. Yeah. My quote of the podcast is Des Moines is a pleasant place. I think we should all just really agree on that.
I'm
That's
telling you,
my quote of the podcast.
Des Moines, if you haven't been, worth a visit, worth a
Worth a
trip.
visit. Okay. Well, thanks again for being on the Be Engaged podcast. And we'll be in touch for sure.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much for having me. Have a great
Yeah.
day.
Thank you for joining the Be Engaged podcast. This podcast was prepared by the author in her personal capacity. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the author and do not reflect the official policy, opinion, or position of her employer. Thank you again for joining. All rights reserved to Be Engaged.